to all, my name is Samuel F.B. Morse. I have lived through a lot of events in the industrialization of our America. In these experiences, I have seen many an invention rise to sweep the nation, ameliorations which have brought the country to a new ideology of united progressive thinking. This, my friends, is a large part of the Industrial Revolution, a time for great changes in the technology and industry of the United States. The early industrialization period of the United States of America was done in order to render America economically independent from Britain. This is the main point we will focus on in our presentation. Now, there have been many factors which have sparked this new way of thinking, but one of which stands out to an individual such as myself is the progression towards the abolition of slavery. Before the sparks of the Revolution, slaves provided us with labor and a method of keeping production and export cheap for the colonies. As the movements for the abolishment of slavery came about, a new need for cost-efficient labor was created. I myself was a large supporter in the slave preservation industry. I have mentioned this in my tracts, saying that slavery has been a salvation. It is not a sin, and no heavier in moral character than hierarchy or employment. However, once the progression to abolish slavery arose, the movement provided a chance for America to develop their own self-sustainable economy. This economy would not be sporadic and based solely on import from labor from outside sources, but rather be permanent and bring about a different age of export. Hence, in order to keep up with cheap labor demands, new innovations in technology and new inventions had to be brought about. The inventions would ensure that a lower expenditure for large businesses and provide a greater profit margin. Even in my support for slavery, I still cannot deny with sane mind that my invention would not have come about as fast if not for the induced Industrial Revolution. This held true in many examples. With there being many rapid streams in the north, there are many business opportunities available in the industrial mill sector. However, Britain had passed multiple laws with harsh punishments for anyone who passed the nation's mill knowledge to America. A young fellow by the name of Samuel Slater recreated a water frame mill in 1789 in Rhode Island, all from memory. All the blueprints were saved in his head. This mill spun cotton fiber into thread, in perfect condition to be used for clothing. In order to expand on this, a wealthy entrepreneur, Francis Lowell, opened up a series of these similar mills all across the northeast of the country, beginning in 1814. These mills created a new industry, the mass production of textiles and cloth. Lowell's Boston Manufacturing Company built residences for the workers in this industry and began forming working cities, with entire populations working in the industrial sector. This business, on top of being financially profitable, provided jobs for the industry as well as the city growth in America. The success of the cotton mill also drove the recreation of new products such as lumber, leather, and wagons, and countless other industry revolutionizing methods and products. The second example I'd like to point out is one by an inspirational young New Englander named Eli Whitney. This young fellow revolutionized the weapons industry by creating interchangeable gun parts. This transported gun making from a slow process to a mass factory setup. The guns would be put together in much greater markets and could be available to individual gun holders as well as armies, and these armies could buy guns for cheaper and more affordable prices, reducing America's outside dependency. The last, but certainly not the least, technological advances I'd like to bring to your attention is my very own invention, the telegraph. In 1832, I began working on my telegraph invention. Alongside this invention, I developed a new and efficient system of sending messages, the Morse code, as fittingly named. To my great delight, in 1844, the very first long-distance telegraph wire was connected between Washington, D.C. and Baltimore. The invention was used by journalists to gather and share news. This organization was called the Associated Press. My partner will talk about this to greater detail later on. Also, the creation of the telegraph allowed for expansion towards the west. Railroad tracks could be taken towards the west, and communication could be sent along with them. Hence, it provided an opportunity for the states to create and for larger states to be formed towards the west side of the country. By 1860, most part of the country were connected by up to 15,000 miles of telegraph wire. As you can see by my work, the telegraph spurred a new era of communication during the Industrial Revolution. As visible that the major advances in technology during the Industrial Revolution were a cause of and a catalyst for progressive thinking. This revolution and its ideologies originated in the search for cheap labor and the abolishment of slavery. Hence, it can be said that with the loss of the slave industry, new requirements for cheap labor resulted in the creation of new and beneficial technologies. Thank you very much.
Let's talk about transportation and communication now, shall we? Transportation and communication in this new industrial era increased profit by enabling internal expansion, and this created new sectors. For example, there were new jobs and corporations coming up, and all of this helped America eventually gain economic independence from Britain. This turned out, in fact, to be better, well, for the most part, for this new nation. In terms of communication, there was the telegraph by Samuel Morse, and since this device was now used to connect the nation, news can now spread at vastly fast speeds. For example, there was the Associated Press, which was an organization that supported the free propagation of information. And these companies, in fact, helped stabilize the United States economy by allowing businessmen to gain information about far-off markets much faster than before. Transactions could now take place at awesomely fast speeds. Since the stock markets, such as the New York Stock Exchange, were critical to the economy of the United States, this fast exchange of information allowed transactions to take place more efficiently, which increased the profit to the businessmen. And all of this aided the internal economy of the United States. But even so, it was in fact the innovations in transportation which truly aided the economy. The biggest innovation to do with transportation was the steam engine, which improved the ability of merchants and entrepreneurs to move goods and to get raw materials from other places. This was done through the railroads and steamboats. The railroads. These aided the expansion of the United States west, which meant there was much greater territory for the United States and much greater internal demand for various products such as iron and coal. For example, a total of 60,000 miles of iron rails was needed to be produced in the initial stages of laying down the railroad tracks as the territory of the United States moved further west from the Mississippi. And in order to fuel all of the trains, coal production increased from 50,000 tons in 1820 to 14 million in 1860. This is in fact a huge difference, and it shows just how much industry was being critical to the economy of the United States. Let's look at the government stance on this. The government itself approved of this railroads, going as far as to invest in these programs. Government spending, as we all know, tends to boost the economy. However, we must consider that the railroads were not extended greatly in the southern states, which did not require industrialization to a great extent. This division of the nation may have led to irreparable divisions in the society of the nation, which was, in fact, a negative step. There were also steamboats, which were critical in terms of making transportation of goods and people more efficient. This was especially true in the Great Lakes area, where there was a great amount of steel being manufactured, which meant that iron ore had to be shipped into the factories and finished steel products shipped out. The most efficient way of doing this was through the waterways. Now, this was also a method of boosting an international economy. American goods can now be shipped elsewhere, for example, across the Atlantic to Europe and the West Indies through steamships, which were now crossing the Atlantic at much faster speeds than before. In terms of immigration, many people were immigrating to America at this time, and 90% of these people were moving by steamship, and this in fact aided the international image of America as an economic powerhouse. And ultimately we can see that the innovations in transportation and communications enabled this new nation to rapidly expand its territories west and to maintain well-connected markets throughout the entire nation, which allowed transactions to happen at unprecedented speeds. This meant that the United States could keep a tightly run and independent internal economy, which is shown by the rise of large cities.
Metropolis today is simply a product of the Industrial Revolution. Industrialization hit the Northeast the hardest, and the earliest. Northeast was home to many merchants and entrepreneurs willing to invest in British practices. In order to truly acknowledge their newly gained independence, the emerging nation felt to compete economically in the world. This motivation drove the success of America's capitalist economy and the growth of their cities. As a result of innovation becoming more popular and technology becoming more common, manufacturing became an important industry, and factories became an industrial giant in order to sustain these demands. Factories were held in large cities, and eventually manufacturing grew to the extent where people in farms and villages were drawn away from their traditional lifestyle into the factories in big cities, where higher wages were guaranteed. As a result of this, populations of these cities skyrocketed. As you can see by this graph, in 1820, only one city, New York City, held a population of over 100,000 residents. By 1860, almost all cities held this title. Although we had farmers and village people moving into these larger cities, there were some traditional schools of thought. Some were reluctant to give up their lifestyle despite the higher wages and the growing metropolises, as they saw the growth of industry to be a diversion from their true calling on the land. Although, despite this fact, cities still grew. New York City, for example, experienced the most growth during this time period, and today it's still the largest city in the U.S. The rise of New York is greatly credited to their practice of the American system of free enterprise, a system which encouraged individuals to make their own choices, to make their own economical decisions in business and practice them without strict government control. This allowed businessmen and entrepreneurs to set up factories in very strategical ways which would maximize profits and product assembly. This is pretty much what ultimately gave rise to the capitalist economy. New York practiced this system religiously and adopted manufacturing premises, steamships, cheap transportation by rail and canal, abundant labor, which all made New York increasingly dominant as an industrial giant. And by the mid-1800s, the New York port had handled more goods and people than all other American ports combined. Along with New York were Buffalo and Detroit, which had also set up factories to meet the demands of the growing populations. Now, as a result of these cities, as the result of the large cities on the rise, the international image of America as a self-sufficient market had been established. As a result of the growing population of these urban cities, this developed America's economic identity in the world, as a trading partner, as everything. Now, as cities grew, as large urban cities grew, there were many other things which were on the rise during this time period. Where the hell is this? Although an expansion in cities indicates a growth in economy, the society within the population will evolve along with this. Thank you.
So now let's go from expanding large cities to workers beginning to organize. The industry boom created a new kind of laborer, the factory worker. Now let's look at this in the perspective of businessmen. They wanted to make profit. That's what a good business does, make profit. So to do this, businessmen imposed high, long working hours and really low wages to factory workers in order to make this profit. So for them, it was a perfect scenario. However, in the perspective of these factory workers, it was no perfect scenario. In fact, it was the quite opposite. They felt that the relationship between businessmen and factory workers was very strained. They believed that they were being ignored and they were being treated unfairly. Due to these poor working conditions for the factory workers, some began to work together in labor unions. During the late 1820s to early 1830s, there were about 300,000 men and women who were a part of some labor union. Now, of course, most of these unions were locally run and focused on specific trades such as shoemaking or printing. Although these labor unions worked separately, they were all fighting for similar causes. They all wanted better working hours, they all wanted better conditions, and they all, most importantly, wanted better wages. During this time, labor unions did not seem to have much effect. From the perspective of the workers, there were problems. Labor unions were not formally recognized as an influential voice. The owners of these businesses would not bargain or even listen to the unions. Since they were not heard much, they had a lack of power and no funds. They could not effectively execute strikes or work stoppages. And this is because the legal system did not support them in any manner. The court ruled against early unions, claiming that they were unlawful conspiracies that limited free enterprise. In 1842, Massachusetts Supreme Court ruled union strikes were legal. Of course, much more decades would pass before unions achieved real influence. Now, the main significance of this is that awareness was being raised by a lot of factory workers that the management side of the business should not all focus on the economic health, but should also focus on the societal health. Because after all, a strong country is made up of a strong society. These unions were designed to be a method where management and labor sides could negotiate conditions, so ideally both parties would be happy.